I'm going to be talking about shifting the anti-meat narrative. I just want to give you a little background on myself. I am a registered dietitian. I'm here just for Groundswell from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm a registered dietitian, so my primary goal is nutrient density, and then how can we produce that in the most environmentally responsible and ethical way. And I have been traveling all over and have a lot more travel coming up. I've just been to Brazil. I was in the UK just a couple weeks ago. I'm going to New Zealand and Australia and Argentina and Ireland very soon. And I've noticed the anti-meat narrative is very different depending on which country you're in. So I'm just going to give you an overview of what I'm seeing and how I push back. I have a book, Sacred Cow, which I just found out is sold out at the bookshop. So thank you for everyone who bought that. Thank you for buying that. And I have a documentary film called Sacred Cow, part of which was filmed in the Lake District with James Rebanks. And I have a very active social media account at Sustainable Dish on Instagram. And then I've recently started a nonprofit called the Global Food Justice Alliance, where I'm pushing back against the anti-meat narrative. And I'm really the only one who's doing this from both a nutrient density and regenerative ag perspective. Okay. Next slide. Oh, that's me. Okay, so we have the charges against meat. It is unhealthy, unsustainable, unnecessary, and unethical. How many of you were at the George Monbiot talk yesterday? Okay. Yeah. I was in the back shaking a little bit. A lot of the questions that I had were answered or asked by the audience, and I have a Twitter thread going with him right now about that. This is definitely his opinion, and I say basically the antithesis of what he says. And it is a very complicated story to unpack, because once you explain the land use and how cattle can utilize uncroppable land and upcycle nutrient-poor food into the perfect food for humans, then they'll talk about how meat causes cancer. So then you explain, well, nutrition research is really tricky, and, you know, comparing typical vegetarians to typical meat eaters is really not fair because there's too many confounding factors, and you kind of go through that whole thing. Well, then it's the water use or the greenhouse gases, or it's just wrong to eat meat and kill beautiful animals. And so this is my day. Every day is this kitty cat. It's really complicated. So my book, Sacred Cow, really goes into detail on how to unpack all of it. The film is an overview, but the book is very detailed. This is an example of my social media account, and really just pointing out that there are very big forces that stand to make a lot of money from telling you that meat is unhealthy, unnecessary, and unethical. Bill Gates is the largest farm owner in the world, and he believes that we should all be eating some kind of protein fiber bar made by him that the world should be eating. So it's very, very dangerous. And I also think that this carbon emissions tunnel vision is very, very dangerous too. So everyone right now, you know, when I was down in Brazil, what I saw was a system that was largely pasture-based now going towards feedlot finishing because less emissions. So that's what's happening there. It's really sad. The less the cow lives, the less emissions. So let's just speed it up, right? And I have a nuanced view on feedlot finishing too. I don't think it's 100% awful. But we've got all these other benefits: water cycles, soil health, biodiversity, livelihoods of the producers. All of these are incredibly important to consider when we're talking about whether or not livestock should be on the planet, right? The reason why everyone is so overly focused on carbon emissions is because that's really the only leg that the anti-meat, alt-meat groups can stand on. So they can't win on nutrition. It's not nutritionally equivalent. It's more expensive. And they can't win on biodiversity, on ecotoxicity, on soil health, or any of these other things. They can only win on carbon emissions. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later about why that's really reductionist thinking. Many of you have heard about the Eat, Land, Set diet, yes? Okay, so the UN Food Systems Summit partnered with the founder of the Eat, Land, Set diet. While they admit that meat is an important source of nutrients, it's also going to kill you, right? And so we can only eat, and there's a little bit of a glare, but basically 3.5 ounces per week of red meat. And that equates about 1 blueberry per day of meat, okay? For chicken, you can eat 2 blueberries per day of chicken, but you can eat 31 grams per day of sugar. Okay. The calorie surplus in our overall Western diet is not from meat. When you look at, this is a chart from 1960, this is all the available data, we can see that the increase in obesity is really from cereals, which is not pearl barley. People are eating that, obviously, in the form of ultra-processed foods, mixed with a lot of fat, industrial oils. And then vegetable oils is the next really big thing. And that's not really a rise in olive oil. That's a rise in ultra-processed oils that are being added to the cereals to create these delicious, hyper-palatable, you can't eat just one food that we are all so addicted to. And that equals almost 60% of a typical Western diet is ultra-processed foods. These are nutrient-poor foods, stimulating you to overeat them. There are very smart people working at these companies making sure that these light up all the reward sensors in your brain, and so you can't say no. Okay, real food doesn't really do that. Ultra-processed foods can do that. There's whole majors you can study in school on how to do that, how to hit that bliss point in the brain. And I threw in a couple of UK-specific slides here. So the availability of ultra-processed foods here in the UK is at an all-time skyrocketed high. And you have a lot of press pushing for this vegan diet here in the UK, especially from The Guardian, which accepts money from an animal rights group for editorial, which is totally, completely unethical journalism. So it's marketing. It's not journalism. It's marketing. But we've got it also now coming from governments, because they're trying to cut down on carbon emissions. So, of course, meat, not fossil fuels, not consumerism, not transportation. It's meat that everybody needs to cut down on. But the unintended consequences of that is just going to be more obesity, more type 2 diabetes, and loss of income for all of you producers out there that are really doing incredible ecosystem services and producing the most perfect food for humans. So these meatless companies that claim to be ethical, healthy, and environmentally pure are the ones that are pumping all this money. There is so much more money to be made in an ultra-processed food, of processing something that's nutrient poor into something that is, hyper-palatable and easily marketed. So, we've seen it in Silicon Valley, just tons and tons of money flowing into all of this protein pancake type things that we heard about yesterday from my friend. There's a lot of money to be made in that, and there's a lot of intellectual property that people can own from that, and it's very, very dangerous from a food sovereignty perspective. This is a piece of social media from Vox, and many of you probably can't see this, but they're saying that, the average person eats roughly, or 174 lives are killed, right? 137 of them are shrimp. So I looked up the code of ethics for journalists, and apparently they're very much supposed to take special care not to misrepresent or oversimplify in promoting a story. So they're not supposed to be pushing stories like this. It's supposed to be balanced journalism. But I've seen The Guardian, I've seen Vox, The Economist, and The New York Times in particular are incredibly anti-meat. They're My book did sell enough copies to make the New York Times bestseller list, and it was not. It's not just a numbers game. It's an opinion game from the New York Times. BBC too, yeah. I'm also really upset about Meatless Mondays. And it's not because I don't think kids should eat a little more salad at lunch. I'm all for fruits and vegetables. That is not what Meatless Mondays is about. Meatless Mondays is largely funded by Johns Hopkins, which is a very anti-meat organization. And Beyond Burger is one of their major funders, so you can go to their website and see who funds them. The New York City Public Schools are doing Meatless Mondays. I know that there's a lot of schools in the UK that are also going meatless on certain days. And to a lot of people, this sounds very benign. What's wrong with some salad at lunch? But the problem is taking meat away from children has never been proven to increase health outcomes ever. So there's no evidence to back up that taking iron, B12, and protein away from growing children is going to benefit them. Additionally, these messages are wrong. A quarter-pound burger uses enough water to fill 10 bathtubs full of water. That's not right. These are incredibly misleading. Kidney disease is not caused by meat consumption. It's not. It's never been caused by meat consumption. Once you have damaged kidneys, eating excess protein is a strain on them, but that doesn't mean it causes it. And then finally, global livestock production creates more greenhouse gases in the entire transportation sector. That's also completely false. But this is the type of messaging in the New York public schools that goes to these kids every single day from kindergarten to 12th grade. It's very, very dangerous information. And when you think about the typical diet of an inner city kid, what do they eat? They eat, sandwiches, chicken nuggets, burgers, mac and cheese. So if you tell these kids that meat is bad, it's not like they're going to go get an expensive kale, chickpea, hemp seed bowl, right? That costs $20 or whatever that is in pounds. They're just going to go get a burger without the meat in it. Right? Like that's going to be the solution. So I have a public letter to Mayor Adams, who claims to be a vegan, although he's not a vegan, on the Global Food Justice Alliance website. And I have a lot of doctors and dietitians that are in the advisory circle of this organization, just pointing out that pulling meat away from kids, 70% of which are low income in New York City, 10% are homeless. They may not have very food secure homes. They already have Meatless Mondays. Now he instituted Vegan Fridays. So think about now 4 days in a row, these kids are going food insecure with absolutely no evidence ever that pulling meat away from kids is healthy. And again, what's wrong? They should just, you should be okay. This is so extremist of you. There's, no problem with giving kids salads. This is what Vegan Fridays looks like. These are actual pictures of Vegan Friday in New York City public schools. So there's an ultra-processed burrito, a banana, and a bag of chips. Any of you familiar with the Global Burden of Disease study? One person, couple people? Okay, so the Lancet published, this is sort of the pinnacle Lancet, which is a pretty well-respected medical journal. And in 2017, that's the bars that are crossed out there. Diets high in red meat, which is just at the bottom of this first section here, were quote unquote responsible for a very small percentage of the global death burden. But 2 years later, in 2019, diets high in red meat were magically 36 times more likely to kill you. Okay? With absolutely no evidence at all to back this up. There were no extra studies that came out in that 2 year period to show that meat is more likely to kill you. And so I'm part of a meat summit coming up in October in Dublin with Frederick Waugh, who was in my film, and Alice Stanton, who's a doctor in Ireland, who wrote a letter to the Lancet demanding that they show evidence for this because this is not okay. The UK food policy is based on the Global Burden of Disease study. Most nutrition papers reference the Global Burden of Disease study. So this is very dangerous. So the bias, I just want to point out, is not only coming from the media, from the fake meat companies that are going to profit, but it's also coming from the science world. So just because something is science does not mean that it can't be biased and incorrect. Okay? Here's some more science. I'm showing here the amount of nutrient deficiencies. This is a hard slide to see. Ty Beal, who's a colleague of mine that works for Gain, has published this on his Twitter feed, so you can see the work that he's put out. But basically, this is showing the top nutrient deficiencies. 43% of children between the age of 6 and 59 months are anemic, and the UK prevalence of anemia is estimated to be 23% in pregnant women and 14% in non-pregnant women. Anemia is from iron deficiency. Guess what the best source of iron is? And this is a chart showing, based on the most prevalent nutrient deficiencies, how do we tackle them with food? At the top is liver, then spleen, kidney, cheese, beef, eggs, bivalves, heart, canned fish, goat, lamb, mutton, crustaceans. There's not protein pancakes generated out of hydrogen. Okay, we absolutely have to have animal source foods in the diet. They are the most nutrient-dense foods per calorie, period. This is the only study that looked at meat versus less meat in kids, and it was done in Kenya. And one group of kids got a meat snack at school. One group got a milk snack. One group got extra calories, and one was a control group. The meat group is the one that won in terms of academics, physical, and behavioral health. So they were better behaved, they performed better physically, and they had better academic scores with just that little extra bit of meat. Very, very important. This is the only study, it's an RCT, that is the gold standard for science. So Meatless Mondays has no leg to stand on with their research. Okay, now I'm going to be talking about optimal meat intake, and this should make steak lovers very happy. So 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is the U.S. standard. It's probably similar to that in the U.K. Is it the same? Okay. So because people don't like to do the math and everything, usually there's just these guidelines that say women need 45 grams and men need 54 grams. But that's based on an ideal body weight of women at 125 pounds. I don't know many women who are 125 pounds. And men at 154 pounds. So when you look at the average weight, so the average UK woman is 70 kilograms. So just the minimum would be 112 grams of protein for the average woman in the UK. The average man is 84 kilograms. That equates at the minimum for the RDA, which is not the optimal amount. The RDA is the minimum to avoid disease. That would be 138 grams of protein. So 100 grams of meat per weight, about like in steak, is 25 grams of protein. So the ideal, according to my calculations, which is doubling the RDA, is 180 grams per day, per meal, 3 times a day. So that is not less meat. That is a lot more meat. And the great thing about meat is not only is it the most bioavailable source of protein, it's the most bioavailable source of just about every single nutrient you need. It is also the most satiating thing you can eat. So the more protein you eat, the more full you feel, and the less you're going to eat of everything else. So even if I were to not take out the junk food in someone's diet and just tell them to eat more meat, they will naturally feel so satisfied and full that they're going to eat less. So I hope that makes you guys feel better about going out and eating more steak today. So we just have to look very carefully at, is this evidence or is this bias? And a lot of times when someone is arguing against meat, they're starting with an ethical debate. It's wrong to kill beautiful animals for your food. But you can't have an intelligent, ethical debate about meat unless you understand the nutritional implications of pulling meat away, especially from children and pregnant women, or the environmental dangers of pulling livestock off the land. So these are the guys that win when we vilify meat. The ultra-processed fake meat companies win. The oil companies win because it takes blame off the oil companies. There's a lot of people winning when we put all of our blame on the cow. Pharmaceutical companies. But aren't we eating too much meat already? So there's this image, especially of Americans, probably of Australians, maybe of Brits too, I'm not sure, that everybody is sitting down to this gigantic tomahawk steak every single night, right? We're eating too much. Meat is gluttonous. It should be, eaten as a treat. But the average American only eats about less than 2 ounces of beef per person per day. It's a very, very small amount. The numbers are very similar in the UK and Australia as well. So we are among the highest meat-eating countries, and we're still only 2 ounces per person per day. And I just want to take a brief moment to address nutrition research because it is incredibly difficult to do nutrition research. Most of it is based on diet recalls. So if any of you has been part of a nutrition research, they give you a little booklet and they say, okay, over the last 3 months or 6 months, how many times did you eat a burger? And you might remember the burger, but they've done studies on this. You're much less likely to remember all the other things you had with the burger, the sugar-sweetened beverages, the deep-fried potatoes, the deep-fried apple pie, like all the other stuff that you've had with that burger. So a lot of the blame goes on burgers, but actually that burger patty in the burger is probably the best thing you could have eaten at that meal. People are also much less likely to remember that they smoke and drink, and they're much more likely to report exercise. So they lie, basically, on these things. So really, randomized control trial is the best way to collect research when you're looking at nutrition, but that's also really hard because it's hard to lock people up in a metabolic ward for 5 years just to see what the difference is in this group eating a little bit of meat and this group not eating meat and seeing what happens. So again, is it the meat or is it all the other things that we eat? So as a dietitian, I would challenge any other dietitian on the fact that that burger and maybe even that hot dog, even though they're just conventional, not grass-fed, these are still the healthiest things on this whole slide. So we can get there are nuances. There's some benefits nutritionally that they're starting to research about grass-fed, but even typical meat for somebody who can't afford regenerative meat is still going to be better for that mom that's working a couple of jobs that wants to give her kids a leg up in the world. She should still be buying steak for her kids because it has iron, it has B12, it has choline, it has all these things that you can't get in other ways. And when they've done research looking at omnivores versus vegetarians, it's really tricky because if your typical vegetarian is much more likely to do yoga, to eat fresh fruits and vegetables, to take supplements, meditate, like to do all those healthy lifestyle things, compared to a typical meat eater who might be more likely to sit around on the couch more, drink beer, do all these other things that are less healthy. But when they've looked at people that shop at health food stores, so therefore sort of adjusting a little bit, your typical health food store shopper has a similar lifestyle, they found absolutely no difference in all-cause mortality between meat eaters and vegetarians. And they found vegans to be much less healthy, actually, in those populations. Okay, now I'm going to go through some slides. These are all things that I've shared. They're on sacredcow.info, or they'll be on the Global Food Justice website, globalfoodjustice.org. I'm just going to compare nutritionally real quick, beans versus beef. A lot of times when you see a vegan meme out there that's comparing beans to beef, they will take uncooked beans by calorie instead of cooked beans by weight. So let's look at equal portions. Okay, so you can see that beef here wins in all of the amino acids. So protein isn't just one thing, it's amino acids. And plant source foods are limited in amino acids. You can still meet your total protein goal with being deficient in certain amino acids, but not if you have meat in your diet. So meat wins. You've got a total protein score of 4 ounces of sirloin steak at 30. 4 ounces of kidney beans is 9. When we look at the minerals and vitamins, we can also see that steak wins, especially on hard-to-get nutrients like zinc, iron, and vitamin B12, which is non-existent in plant source foods. This is another very popular social media meme that I put out, just talking about bioavailability. So what does 25 grams of protein look like? I compare how many calories you need to eat of the plant source foods to get the same amount of protein that you would get in beef. So you only need 180 calories worth of beef for 25 grams of protein. But look how much quinoa, peanut butter, and beans you need. Way, way, way more. But then there's also this protein digestibility score. So just because a plant source food has protein doesn't mean that your body can actually access and utilize that protein. So meat has a protein digestibility score much higher than plant source foods. And in every case where there's a plant source nutrient and an animal source nutrient, the body prefers the animal source nutrient. I think that's my teenager texting me, by the way. Sorry about that. Why are we blaming the oldest foods for the newest diseases? I think that's a really important question that we need to be asking. And I just got back from the Museum of Natural History in London, where I went to this very special exhibit on climate change. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with this exhibit there, but they have little stickers that all the kids can wear talking about how they're going to switch out their meat for futuristic foods. So, but why not just rewild it? So I actually took my 18-year-old, who's texting me right now, and we sat down and we watched wolves change the rivers at Yellowstone. Have you guys all seen that video? It's amazing, right? And I asked him, what's wrong with this, though? He said, well, this is great. I said, yeah, okay, but what's wrong with this? Like, could we do this everywhere? Oh, can't do this everywhere. What are you going to do with the humans that live in this area, who have lived in that area for a long time and get their livelihood from that area? Do they all have to move to cities? How are we going to manage the populations for both overpopulation and move these animals around? We need to introduce predators. So regenerative ranchers can do this with electric fencing and culling, which is great. It can work in harmony with nature. It can provide livelihoods for people while providing an ecosystem service. Or we can just annihilate all the humans that live there and introduce wolves and just rewild it all. And I think especially as we're looking at the looming food crisis that we're going to be having from the war in Ukraine, rewilding is just not going to be a very practical option when we have to start really looking at utilizing as much land as we can to produce nutrients for people. So there's a difference between producing calories for people, which we have plenty of calories. Someone can have enough total calories and still be nutrient deficient. We need nutrients. Livestock is the best way to get nutrients to people. But isn't it more humane to just let an animal die naturally? So I'm sure most of you have seen some form of National Geographic, either on TV or on your farms or out in the wild, and have noticed that natural death is not a beautiful Bambi situation where the animal just closes its eyes in the middle of the night and goes to sleep for the rest of its life, right? We as humans are able to be humane in the way that we deal with the harvesting of our animals. And so to give them a healthy, protected life and to give them just one bad day, I would argue is a much more ethical way than an animal living a long time, having a broken leg, and then being eaten alive by a hyena. And then also we get to eat and not just the hyenas, which is really great. So these are all the questions I have about rewilding. I'll post this so you guys can read it. But basically, these were all the questions I wanted to ask George Monbiot yesterday. Are birds less of an animal than a cow? If you don't see blood or bones on your plate, does that mean something didn't die for you? So basically, at the end of the day, if you accept that death has to happen in order for you to live or for life to happen, which is just a basic law of nature, then you are responsible for that death. And you can also be responsible for that life. And it can be a life that increased biodiversity and ecosystem health and the water holding capacity of the soil and overall ecosystem function. Or you can just put blinders on and eat beans and decide that no death happened and you're pure and have reached nirvana. So in a more regenerative system, we have no chemicals required, increased soil life, healthier ecosystem, all this stuff compared to typical extractive methods that are chemical based. Also, not all land can be cropped, and cattle provide ecosystem services. So that was something that was left out of the talk yesterday, where he said, well, these cattle just take up too much land. But they're not taking away. They don't have to take away from land that's arable. And they can even be a complement to arable land. They can improve the fertility of arable land, as you all know. And we have an organization in the U.S. called Audubon. I'm sure there's bird organizations here that are similar, but they're actually now partnering with ranchers in the U.S. because they've noticed that the decline in birds that are migrating across the U.S. is 100% due to extractive chemical agriculture. And they need more grazers out there. And so there's a whole bird-friendly grazing certificate that ranchers can get. And these ranchers are actually providing very important habitat for birds. So 60% of the agricultural land that we have is absolutely unsuitable for anything but grazing animals. So when you hear livestock take up too much land, it's not really apples to apples land. Some land is too hilly, too rocky, too wet, too dry. Many, many different reasons why you can't crop it, but you could definitely graze animals there. And prairie systems are very ecodiverse and only exist because of grazing animals. That's correct. Yeah. Right. Not everywhere wants to be a forest either. That's like we plant a tree for every whatever you purchase. I don't want trees everywhere. There's a lot of places that don't want to be forests. They want to be open grasslands. This is a study that came out of the United States trying to put a number against grazing that happens in the U.S. And what they found was for every beef cow, it was over $1,000 U.S. of ecosystem services that animal provided. And that's not even regenerative grazing. And that's even these animals ending up on a feedlot. This is just like typical grazing. A lot of people don't know this, but 85% of the beef cattle population in the U.S. right now is grazing on land that can't be cropped. So even if they end up at a feedlot, there's still great grazing that can happen. And even those folks that are grazing could be doing even better with regenerative practices. Livestock can turn food we can't eat into protein. So that's great in a totally pasture-based system. But even when they're given, I was just talking to a guy, maybe he's in here, who's raising Wagyu. Hey. So cattle being fed spent brewers, grains, things like that. That stuff has no other use in our food system. You can't feed it to pigs and chickens. You can feed it to a cow and upcycle it into protein. So that's why I'm not 100% against the variety of practices that might work best for whatever that producer is doing. For some producers, they want to be 100% pasture-based. That's awesome. But in other situations, it might make more sense if there's a brewery next door to utilize that. And that's totally okay. And it's still upcycling food that's going to sit in a pile and emit methane if it didn't get turned into protein from a cow. Most of the water is rainwater. that is attributed to cattle. So 92%, and this is even typical beef that's finished on a feedlot. The number 4 grass-finished beef is about 97%. And again, this is, completely different if you're looking at a more desert area versus a more humid area. But this is the average in the U.S. for beef that end up on a feedlot. 94% of the moisture of the water, that's a footprint of that cow, is moisture that's already in what they're eating. But that gets attributed to water, like bathtubs full of water, meatless Mondays, right? So the blue water footprint, blue water is what you see when you look at a map and you see blue, like the lakes and rivers and aquifers. That's blue water. The blue water footprint of beef is actually quite low, and it's less than walnuts, sugar, and rice. So it's just important to look at the type of water that you're talking about. Greenhouse gas emissions, this is the biggie, right? So here's the U.S. numbers. As you probably can't see the small print there, but the first few bars are transportation, electricity generation, and industry. Those are the problems that we need to be addressing. Eating a little less meat is not going to move the needle at all when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So beef in the U.S. is about 2%. But then there's also a big difference in the type. So just like the water, there's also a big difference with greenhouse gases. So in the case of fossil fuels on the left, we are pumping ancient carbon from the ground and bringing it directly into the atmosphere. But in the case of beef, they're actually eating carbon from grass. Through their digestive system, they're turning that into methane. After 10 years, that methane oxidizes and turns into CO2, which is carbon dioxide, and H2O, which is water. The water becomes part of the water cycle. The CO2 becomes part of the photosynthesis process.
Sorry, can I just make this is about methane. One animal, according to Walter Yenny, managed on correctly managed grassland, can produce, what's the name? Basically,
A net sink.
No, it can produce oxalates that will absorb 10 times the amount of methane that the cattle emits.
Right. Yeah.
That's not meant to, you'd never hear that.
Right. So there's a bunch of research projects out there right now to quantify this, and it's going to be different in every system. And also, animals can build soil, so that's not even part of the equation yet. There's some really good research that's starting at Michigan State University that I'm involved with there, with the Center for Regenerative Research, looking at gas exchanges. But the point of this is just to show that the CO2 just becomes part of the photosynthesis process. The carbon becomes the grass, becomes the roots, goes down to feed the bacteria. Up to 40% can get sequestered. Some people think it's much more than that. It probably could be. We don't have more methane-emitting ruminants than we did before we got rid of all the wild ruminants here in the UK or in North America. So as long as the cattle herds stay relatively the same, we don't have a methane problem at all. The problem is CO2. And when you look at the rate increases of CO2, that's the main problem. And CO2 stays in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. So I go into this more in the film and the book. There was one paper that looked at what would happen to greenhouse gases and our nutrient status if we eliminated all livestock from the U.S. diet. And what they found was greenhouse gas emissions, net emissions, would only go down 2.6%, but our overall calorie intake would go up. And that's because we would have to eat more beans, much more calories there. Probably not a good thing when we're looking at 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. Our carbohydrate intake would go way up. Again, as a dietitian, not a good thing. And our nutrient deficiencies would go up. So essential fatty acids, and then those important nutrients that you can only get from animal source foods or are best absorbed from animal source foods. Vitamin A, calcium, and B12. We also need to start looking at the food print of obesity. So what happens when people are over consuming these ultra-processed foods? There's a huge expense with all the diabetic plastics involved, amputations, dialysis. I mean, the expense of sick people needs to be calculated into these awful diets that people are eating, but currently they're just looking at cow burps. So our opportunities, for those of you who haven't seen, I was on the Joe Rogan podcast. It was a nice long 3-hour interview. I think for producers out there to try to get social media influencers to your farm so that they can understand better. A lot of them can debate the nutrition benefits of meat, but they don't really understand that environmental piece. And so just showing them your process can really, really transform someone. Short videos. I'm going to be doing a workshop again with Ed Horton. He is really good, EA Horton, on Instagram, of just doing these quick little sort of monologues explaining his process. I think all producers should be doing something like that. And then just talking about food equity and how the anti-meat movement is elitist, it's ultra-processed, it's expensive, it's unsustainable, and it's only making people like Bill Gates rich. It is the opposite of food sovereignty. So the other piece I want to mention when we're talking about inclusion is that meat is a very important piece of almost every traditional diet. And so to tell people that they need to be eating less meat is questionable, I think, from a culturally inclusive perspective. So, great. So many people have an unconscious bias against meat. Meat is nutrient-dense, affordable, and traditional. Messages vilifying meat are largely based on bias or exaggerations. There's a journalistic code of ethics that they need to be held to, that people need to be calling them out on. I think we all need to work to improve the system and try to include typical producers and not tell them that, you know, what they're doing is bad, but to be a little more welcoming to producers that maybe don't have the same standards that you have, and shepherd them along a little bit. And so for a healthy, sustainable, and equitable food system, animal source foods must be included and not vilified. Here's all the research, the resources. So we've got the Sacred Cow, my Instagram. I have a podcast as well. And then the globalfoodjustice.org has graphics. I have also a letter template for anyone whose local government or school wants to go meatless. I have a template to help people craft the words to push back against that. And I also have a Patreon community that people can join, and it's a nonprofit. So thank you so much for your support, and I'm happy to take questions.
What do you think of the Nova food classification, and why don't places like the US or Britain implement them?
Remind me what Nova is again. I've seen the French, like, red.
Is it in Brazil?
No, it's a Brazilian thing, Diane. There's classifications for food.
Okay.
Classification, what we get from the ground.
Oh, okay. That sounds awesome. That sounds really good. I've read the Brazilian food guide that they have, and they take very big care in classifying foods into, home cooked, processed, and then ultra processed, and also they warn consumers not to trust messages coming from marketing from packaged food companies. Unfortunately, Brazil has among the highest rates of sugar consumption. I don't know that the message is making it to people, but their food policy, which you can Google and try, it's hard to find in English, but you can. I think it needs to be the anchor for all other countries.
Hey, Diana, thanks for the talk. I really like your Instagram, by the way, so I'll be following that. So my question is more about why beef specifically seems to be targeted, and is there any research into what is caused by excess consumption of chicken and how that's all in feedlots and factories? So what are your thoughts on that?
there's a lot of animal rights groups that were trying to like end all slaughter. They were trying every angle they could. They did the cage-free egg thing. I mean, chicken consumption is an all-time high. It's gone up 400% in the last about 10 years. And I would argue to any consumer that if they're just in the grocery store and their choice is factory farmed pork, factory farmed chicken, or feedlot finished beef, that beef nutritionally and ethically wins because at least those animals weren't inside eating only grains their entire lives. I think that this carbon tunnel vision is a hot button that has really allowed them to accelerate, because cattle produce more methane than chicken and pork. That's really the hot button right now. So for climate change. Also, cows look like dogs more than chickens do, and so they're like more beautiful. And so, like, to play on the heartstrings of people, I think people can anthropomorphize a cow better.
Hi, Diana. One of the things that bugs me on social media is vitamin B12. And you've just said today that you can't get vitamin B12 from plant material. So vegans are now saying that farmers feed it to their cows. So can you tell us, can you explain to us where
I don't
it
know
comes
where
from?
that came from.
Yeah, I know. But where does it come from?
I don't know.
How do
Some
the
crazy vegan started
But how
that
do
one.
the cows produce it? Well, how is it? How do they generate vitamin B12 that we can access? And actually, where do the vegans get theirs? I want to understand both sides.
Yeah.
You can't find a valid attack, then you make one up.
Yeah. I don't know where that came from. I've been trying to, every time I get on a podcast with a dietitian, that's the first thing we start laughing about. It is present in some sea vegetables, but a lot of times that's a B12 analog that actually increases your deficiency and need for B12 because it like pretends that it's B12 and locks into the receptors and actually makes it worse, your B12 deficiency worse. B12 deficiency can cause permanent brain damage, and there has been documented cases of babies dying from a breastfeeding mother who was taking vegan B12 supplements. So it's a very, very serious nutrient that we have to have. How cows make B12, there must be some kind of animal scientist in here that knows that. I can tell you what we need it for as a dietitian. I don't know how cows make it. I know vegans will say from their stomach. Yeah. Vegans will say it's from soil and that you just need to eat more dirt. I don't know. It's like such a waste of time that I haven't even really looked into it very much. I'll go to you in the red sweater. Just to make this guy run.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I just want to pick up on the answer you gave to the question before last, where you sort of suggested that this whole anti-meat campaign is led by militant, animal rights people. It can't all be about that. I happen to think that intensive meat production, livestock production, causes a great deal of misery to animals and is the wrong thing to do. I'm a meat eater, and I came because I'm worried about the anti-meat narrative that is building. But what's your explanation for the fact that it seems that 98% or 100% of climate scientists are absolutely wedded to this? As we have to reduce our meat intake. It's absolutely vital to dealing with climate change. And do you accept that in any way, certainly in the global north, we should be reducing our meat intake? I mean, I thought your slide about actually how not as much meat is eaten by Americans as is popularly believed. So what's your position, really, when it comes to climate change and meat eating?
Thank you. It's really complicated, so I'll try. I have a lot. The older I get, the more nuance I see in everything, right? So I don't believe in a black and white solution. I think that a doctor would never say eat only organic vegetables or don't eat vegetables, even if he was a proponent of organic vegetables, right? To a low-income patient of his, he would never say don't eat that broccoli unless it's organic, right? As a public health dietitian, I think meat is incredibly nutrient dense and people need to be eating it. I also think it can be done in a better way and that there are serious problems in the meat industry. But we don't have the amount of regenerative grass-fed meat at scale right now to feed all of the people. And a lot of people that I work with are really low income and just are trying to make ends meet. And I can't tell them to only eat grass-fed or eat less because they need that nutrition. Kids need that nutrition. And meat is the best source of almost every nutrient that we need. It has almost everything, with except for like folate and vitamin C. Meat has everything we need, and it's filling, and it's low calorie. So it's really a wonderful food. That doesn't mean that I'm pro animal torture by any means. It just means that I see the need for meat and I see the need to improve the system at the same time. And climate change. I don't think that most climate scientists necessarily think reducing meat is the number one thing we need to be doing. I think the majority of them actually believe it's a fossil fuel thing. I think that the eating less meat, it's like recycling. You know, they put it on the consumer, all this extra plastic, but it's really those corporations that are making the extra plastic, and they're the ones that need to take responsibility for it. But instead, they put it on the kids to come home and shame the parents, and then everyone felt guilty about all these plastic bottles. But our personal recycling, when you look at the numbers, makes a very small dent in the overall plastics usage and whole entire problem out there with plastics. So I don't necessarily think people need to be eating less meat. I mean, some people eat too many calories and they should overall eat less overall, but not necessarily like just tackle the meat. Like eat less French fries, eat less cake, eat less, you know, there's so many things I could say to eat less of.
Sorry, just on that, what about the removing the forests to make room for more? Like I also eat meat too, but
What about the forests that we're killing to eat more cattle? Yeah, I mean, we have an overpopulation problem that gets really dicey to start talking about, right? So I'm just not even going there because that is just really dangerous. We're not... Yeah, I mean, so I have a post about this Amazon rainforest thing. So in North America, we're actually in a net forest gain right now. In South America, when we're like the burning of the rainforest for Brazilian beef, it is way more complicated than that. How much time do I have? 2 minutes? Okay. I have a post about it, but basically it's a very poor region, and the policy down there right now is if you clear the land, you get to own it. Okay? And so what they do is they go in, they harvest the timbers, they sell those, then they burn the rest of it. Can't do much with it after it's burned except for graze it with cattle. So they put in cattle. Once the cattle have added fertility to the soil and flatten the land a little bit more, then they plow it and plant soy for soy oil that goes into ultra-processed foods and soy cakes that go to feed chickens in China.
and 80% of it is for animal feed.
For chicken.
Fine, but we're talking about eating meat, not just beef, and 80% of soy production is for animal feed. So they might be deforesting it to get the timber, but they're still
I have a slide about global animal feed and what competes with us for food. And so it's only 13% of what is fed to animals actually competes with humans for food. And in the case of cattle, it's 2.5 pounds of grain to 1 pound of meat, 2.5 to 1. And that's in a grain-finished cow, which most people aren't doing here. So as a dietitian, I would, if you were to put 2.5 pounds of corn in front of me or 1 pound of steak, I would choose the 1 pound of steak. The 2.5 is the same with chicken. With pork, it's a little bit higher. But meat is far more valuable to us as humans than grain. Yes?
I think that actually touch a good point. It's that when you speak about meat quite often, people are doing a big confusion about between intensive farming
Yep. Yeah. I'll say it out loud after she's.
Sorry, I just say it's important when we speak about meat and to break this bad narrative, just to precise that there is a difference between intensive farming with all its potential defect and, let's say, grass-fed meat and extra. Because I saw quite often, I'm a journalist myself, so I receive a lot, and I saw sometimes messages where they speak meat, and I'm looking and I'm suddenly seeing, oh, actually they're speaking about industrial, intensive meat farming. And they said, but you never said it. You just said meat. But actually it was a certain kind of way.
No, actually, when I talk about nutrition...
Not you, but people anti-meat doesn't do the difference. And I think to fight against them, it's also to make the difference between the way to produce, I think. Because it's not the same.
Yes, but to say that only grass-fed is the only
No.
kind is not...
I totally agree, but I think excess and radicalism is bad at both sides.
Yes.
But I'm just thinking also that people don't realize that, for example, in, let's say, grass-fed, mob grazing, blah, blah, you are rebuilding the soil, etc., etc.
But that can even happen in typical beef production. So I just want to make that clear. For anyone who's seen my film, the Pinnacle Ranch in Mexico, in Chihuahua, where he has completely transformed the desert back into grasslands. After he's done all this amazing regenerative, he's a savory accredited hub, he sells to feedlots because his land can't support the finishing, and economically it makes sense for him, and that's okay. And so I just think we need a little more flexibility and a little less... rigidity in our view of livestock farming.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Time up. Okay, so I'm going to be doing this social media thing, and at 3 o'clock I'll be available over by the breakout tent if anyone else has questions.